Okay, well, I know this is a fun topic, and everyone knows, I'm sure everyone's revised their entire hazard communication program, correct? So when OSHA comes to your door tomorrow for a planned inspection, you'll have everything ready for them? Is that right? Yeah, I figured. Well, you'd be surprised. I think most of the people here in this room are aware of the issue, but you know, I've actually had calls where people have I've gotten calls from obviously smaller facilities saying, "I just heard about this revised standard last week. What do I need to do?" So there's still a lot of people out there that really aren't familiar. And so what I want to go through here is make sure that you're all up to speed on what your requirements are as of June 1. OSHA came out with their directive for their compliance, safety, and health officers, basically their inspectors. They came out with their directive last week, and it completely lists everything that the inspectors need to do, what they need to look for when they come to a facility. And it specifically stated in that directive that grain handling facilities meet the definition of chemical manufacturer. Okay? So it says it right there. According to OSHA, if you're a grain handling facility, you're a chemical manufacturer. So what does that mean? That means that you are considered for whole grain, which I'll cover, is considered a chemical hazard by OSHA. So that's something to be aware of. Now this disclaimer here is basically saying, obviously the material that's in the guidance document, pretty much the presentation that I'm going to be going through, a majority of the material is from this guidance document. The guidance document is posted on the NGFA webpage. If you go to the NGFA webpage, ngfa.org, and you go to the safety section, you can download this 50-page document. But basically what it's saying, it's, this material is designed to assist, to help, but it's each individual company's facility, it's their decision on how they want to address this issue. So, as I said, I'm going to go through a summary of the revisions to the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, a general description of the guidance document, and go through some of the FAQs on this topic. So everyone's asking, well, how did this happen? Did this just happen? Did OSHA just come out with some type of letter? Did they just come out with some type of policy change? How did this happen? Why is June 1 such a magic date? Well, OSHA came out, and it was in March of 2012, OSHA published their final rule revising the Hazard Communication Standard. I think, as we all know, the Hazard Communication Standard you think of as the last version was published in 1994. Well, they came out with a revised version in 2012, and what they were trying to do is harmonize their existing standard with revisions that were made to the United Nations globally harmonized standard for labeling. Okay, so that was the goal. The whole purpose of the UN's GHS is they want to make sure that the types of safety data sheets and labels that are used globally are synchronized, so to speak. So what you use in Europe, what you use in North America, what you use in Asia is essentially the same format. That's the purpose of the UN's committee. So what OSHA did is they revised their hazard communication standard to as far as the certain areas that are being addressed there. So it was combustible dust, data sheets, and labeling are the three key areas for the grain handling industry that were revised in OSHA's standard. So this just shows you the dates. I think y'all are aware that December 1, 2013, that was the deadline that all the employees had to be trained on what the changes were to the standard. I'm sure everyone did that and has that on record that all the employees were trained by that date. June 1, 2015, December 1, 2015, it's compliance with all modified provisions of the final rule. So as I said, you're a chemical manufacturer and importer and distributor. That's how grain handling facilities are all considered. So you basically have to make sure that all you have your revised safety data sheet and you're providing it to your downstream users. So June 1, you give OSHA, they're going to give you 6 months. So starting in December, when they come around for their programmed inspections, it'd probably be a good idea to have some documentation that you're up to speed on these new requirements. And then June 1, 2016, it's It's for employers, so i.e. if you're not a manufacturer or distributor, you have to comply. So, the question is this combustible dust issue, how did this come about, right? How did OSHA just all of a sudden determine that combustible dust was going to be included and combustible dust was that it's a chemical hazard? Well, when this came out, NGFA and several other trade groups, we obviously discussed this. Our Safety, Health, Environmental Committee, there was a lot of concern about this, and so we essentially sued OSHA. We filed a brief, as they call it, the legal term, a brief for reconsideration with OSHA. And so this is going back to 2012. It's with the U.S. Court of Appeals, the second highest court in the land. It's right below the Supreme Court. And so we sat with OSHA. We tried to have a settlement discussion with OSHA. OSHA was pretty much saying that, hey, combustible dust, grain dust, it's all the same. It's a chemical hazard. It's part of the standard. And we said, well, we don't agree with the process that you went through to make this determination. It wasn't in any type of proposed rule. You just stuck it in here. And when we had our settlement discussions, we didn't really get anywhere, so we said, okay, we're going to go to court. So we had an argument before the D.C., the District Court of Appeals back in September. And two of the judges on that, it was a three-judge panel, two of the judges were appointed by Bush 41 and Bush 43. And they came out with a decision in October, and it was 3-0 against industry, saying, well, we agree with OSHA. We think they went through the proper rulemaking process to make this determination. So guess what? It's here. I don't really know what else we can do if we lost a legal fight against it. From a political standpoint, the question is, well, why doesn't Capitol Hill do something? Why don't we go tell our congressman, well, this isn't an issue that you can change through any type of legislation, right? This is something that's a pretty technical issue. If anything, maybe through appropriations, if you can cut funding to OSHA to enforce this. But from a political standpoint, the best chances is a new administration. If there was a business-friendly, say, a Republican administration, maybe you could go back through the agency and they could do what they've done, like with other issues, and come out with some letter of interpretation or directive saying that, whole grain or grain dust isn't a chemical hazard. But until then, this is what it is. So, until then, a grain handling facility is a chemical manufacturer. That means that whole grain, when processed, turns into combustible dust, right? I don't think we can contest that. I think everyone knows, that's what it is. So what that means is you're going to have to create safety data sheets for that product. And you're going to have to ship it down to your downstream users. So, obviously, I think we all know as far as, what hasn't changed. As far as the, SDSs have to be accessible to the workers. And as far as hazard communication, make sure that information is available to them and they understand, what type of PPE goes with that. As far as the hazard classification labels, the safety data sheets, the big issue with the safety data sheets is I'll go through, it has 16 sections. The previous MSDS had 8 sections, and the new version has 16 sections in it. So, I'll cover that. This is actually, and I didn't have a chance to put it in here, but as I said, OSHA came out with their directive for their inspectors. That's on OSHA's webpage, but they also came out with some documents. Basically, this document here, it's basically telling OSHA the type of an inspector, what he can use, the type of testing to use if he goes out to a facility and isn't sure if the dust is combustible or not. Basically tells them, all the NFPA and ASTM and different types of tests you can use to determine if it's combustible. As I said, I think we all agree that grain dust is combustible. I'm not going to contest that. In this memo here, this is another important memo. On February 9th, this is a memo that basically is saying that if you don't meet this June 1 deadline, so if OSHA came into your facility and you don't have a safety data sheet for your product, i.e. grain, or if you're a feed manufacturer or whatever, if you don't have an SDS, you have to have documentation saying why you don't have that SDS. So for example, if a product you develop like feed depends on a premix ingredient that you get from a supplier, and you haven't developed that safety data sheet, you have to say, well, here's the documentation. I called the supplier and I sent an email and they haven't sent me anything. So that's something to consider. If there's some type of, and it could be anything, there's different types of chemicals, different types of items that you use at your facilities that you have the safety data sheet for. If you don't, for some reason, you don't have that safety data sheet now, you have to have an explanation why you don't have it. So as I said, OSHA, they've combustible dust in the revised hazard communication standard is considered a hazardous chemical. So the new requirements, as I mentioned, that's all, it means you're the creator of the safety data sheet. However, as I'll talk about later, what's very confusing about this is it specifically says in the standard that whole grain when processed produces dust. And as a result, you need to create a hazard communication label for the whole grain. However, anything that is subject to the FDA provision, so if it's subject to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act labeling requirements, then it's exempt from the hazard communication labeling requirements. Okay? So if it's feed, that falls under the FDA labeling requirements. You do not need a hazard communication label for a feed product, right? I think we can make the argument that whole grain, corn, wheat, soybean, Milo, whatever, is a food, right? Couldn't you make that argument that's a food and it would fall under the FDA labeling requirements? But OSHA says whole grain is also subject to the labeling requirements, right? So you tell me which is which. As I said, it's up to each company's individual discretion from a risk standpoint. Do you want to put a label on all of your grain? I mean, if that's what you choose to do, you can do that. But you could also make the argument, too, that a whole grain is a food product that falls under the FDA labeling requirements. So that's what we try to explain here in the guidance document, the difference. And, from the trade association standpoint, that's where we can't tell you what to do. We want to make sure you have the information, you understand the standard, what's in here in the standard, but as far as how you want to implement that at your individual company, that's going to be your decision. So I'm going to go through here. So are there any questions? Let me just go back. So any questions then about what I've covered as far as a background on the standard and its requirements for the industry? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's going to be based individually on each inspector. I mean, I don't think as an overall program, and I think in the memo that I mentioned that came out in February of this year, I mean, basically you have to show a good faith effort why you don't have it, right? So if you're the originator, if you're a grain elevator, you're a manufacturer, right? So you create the grain and the dust. So if you don't have the safety data sheet, what would be your explanation to OSHA for not having it? Well, other chemicals, no, I agree. I mean, if there are other chemicals, like if you get chemicals from a supplier, right, and they haven't sent it to you, whatever it may be. I mean, there are chemicals that you use from an operation standpoint. I mean, as I said, if you're a feed manufacturer, there's premix ingredients, the items you have to use. You have to but you have to have, like everything else with OSHA, the more documentation you have, the better. So if you were to have something, if they said, well, how come you don't have it for, say WD-40, right? You have WD-40, where's your safety data sheet? And it's like, well, look, I have here's the copy of the email I sent, here's the phone log. I tried to contact WD-40, and they just said they'll get it to me. So how are you supposed to have it for WD-40 if, they don't send it to you, right? I mean, that's my suggestion on that is the more having it in writing, having documentation showing that the good faith effort, because if you just come in, if OSHA comes in and you say, hey, I've been trying, and they're like, really? Can you show me how you've tried? Well, I mean, here's the phone number. You can call this place. I had several phone calls. I mean, how does that, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I know that's an extreme example, but I'm just to kind of, as far as getting the point across about, about having documentation would be helpful. So anyway, as I said, this feed and food labeling, I know this is probably the most confusing part, and I know it's a discretionary part. It's a determination on how each company wants to approach it. But this is pretty much, as far as the guidance document, what we describe. So as I said, feed and food labeling, so feed products. So animal feed products fall under the FDA labeling requirements. The hazard communication label is not required. A safety data sheet for that feed product is required. Why? Because I think we all agree feed products, they contain grain, right? And according to OSHA, grain is a chemical hazard. So I've had a lot of people have said, well, a feed pellet, that's not going to blow up. That's not hazardous. So I said, well, okay. Does it contain grain? Well, yes. Okay. Well, OSHA has classified whole grain as a chemical hazard. So what you would have to have is documentation that your specific grain used in your pellet feed is not a hazard. So do you have documentation on that? Then that's what you could use to, that's the whole reason why you need the SDS for the feed product, is because of the grain is considered the hazard. So this means, as we all know, I know obviously some of the feed companies in here, that's, you can have some feed products that could have, 25, 50 different ingredients. Well, that all has to be included in one safety data sheet. Yeah. For feed or grain. Uh-huh. No, you're not required because DOT, and I'll talk about that, DOT has not changed its classification of hazardous material. Yeah. So NOPA, I'm sorry, so you're saying NOPA is labeling?
Well, we're labeling our NOPA bags percentages.
But you're with, I think I know, are you with your company? Right. So that's your company's decision, right? So, no, but what product? A feed product or is? Okay, so soybean meal. Okay, well that's soybean. That's not I guess you could consider soybean meal a feed product, but usually I'm thinking of a feed product if you mix it with other types of ingredients like selenium, limestone, premix, whatever. That's what I think. But as processed soybean, that's a soybean meal. Like I said, you could go either way, right? A soybean, you process soybean, you have soybean meal, right? Is that for human? You could make the argument that soybean meal is used for human food consumption, right? But as far as you said, a NOPA label, is that what your company's using? Okay, but it's your individual company's decision to include the label.
Right, just err on the side of caution.
Correct, and that's kind of where it gets back to from the risk, from the risk standpoint. It's like if you want to take zero risk, even though you have that language in there that says, okay, well, is it food, non-food? If you want to put the label on there, you can. If you don't want to put the label, I mean, there's also, you could look at the other side of the argument too, right? So everyone says, people want, when a regulation comes out, they want a black and white answer, right? It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, most of the time, there's a lot of that gray area there because guess what? It gives those regulatory agencies more discretion. Gives them leeway. Yeah. So the question is, have there been any active OSHA inspections? No, as I mentioned, the directive, OSHA just issued their directive for their inspectors last week. So as far as I'm aware, I don't think there have been any inspections that OSHA, the grain handling industry for several OSHA regions, we're on the programmed inspection list, right? So regions like here, Region 7, Region 5, Region 6, Region 8, they're programmed inspections. So if there's not an incident or an employee complaint, they're going to come out to the facility, for a program inspection. My guess is since this just came out June 1, they're going to give about 6 months, right? They're going to give people about 6 months to implement the programs. But my guess is starting in December, January, that's when they come out for inspections. They'll be looking. And if you read the directive's posted on the OSHA webpage under their, the enforcement part of their webpage, and it has a complete list of what they're looking for, what an inspector's going to look for. They're not going to look at the details of the SDS, right? They're not going to make sure, oh, you got this feed product, this is wrong. No, they're going to look, do you even have one, first of all? And did you fill out all the sections properly? Like, is each section filled out the way it should be? So that's what they're going to be looking for. Now, this whole label issue, as I've discussed, I don't know. I mean, if they did issue a citation for labeling, couldn't you make the argument, well, it's subject to the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act labeling requirements? But as I said, if you don't want to take the risk and you want to label everything, that's your decision. So hazard classification, under the revised standard now, employers are required to evaluate they're required to classify the hazard, not evaluate the chemical, but classify the hazard. So that's the other change in the language that they've used. So when you get into this hazard classification issue, that's when you get into the whole mixtures. And as I've talked about with like a feed product, that's considered a mixture, right? Because you not only have grain, but you also have, more than 1%. You could have for a feed product, and I know there's those within the feed industry here, you could have 50% of the product could be grain, and then you could have 5% selenium and 5% limestone and 5% premix. That's considered a mixture under the revised standard here. So you can, if you have similar products, right, so you could have the same type of feed product, but, for each client producer, one may want, a certain type of, premix and the other one doesn't. You could do a generic data sheet for that. You wouldn't have to do a specific one for each specific product. And this is just an example here, on what's the concentration and the cutoff. I mean, they have all the acute toxicity and skin corrosion and eye damage and all of that stuff. That's all hazard classification. So the new safety data sheet format is, I think you're all, for those of you putting together, I mean, this is the change. There's 16 sections. 12 sections 12 through 15 aren't, they're optional. They're not required, but, the other sections are, the physical and chemical properties. The physical, that's where dealing with the combustible dust, that's where you deal with the physical hazard. The previous, intent of the 1994 version of the HAZCOM standard was pretty much safety and health, right? I mean, that's what it was designed for. And obviously the physical hazards, that's part of the change. And that was the argument OSHA had, that we lost in court. They said, well, hey, if you look at the 1994 version, it says that, agricultural dust is a hazard. It's a chemical hazard. And the issue is they never enforced that. I don't think we're aware of a single inspection OSHA had from 1994 until today where they issued a citation to a facility for, not properly addressing the chemical hazards of agricultural dust in the MSDS. But that was their argument, and that's what the court agreed to in the decision. So now the frequently asked questions that come along, this just kind of show you. I mean, I know it's hard to read here on the screen, but this is what we put together. We had to determine, okay, well, you have farm, storage, processing, manufacturing, distribution, customer, and as we put in the guidance document, based on all the questions that we had, it's like, okay, well, where does it originate, right? Where does the safety data sheet or where does the label originate? Who is responsible? Because the question would be is like, okay, if you're a feed manufacturing facility, but you get the grain from the elevator, right? So who's responsible? Well, the grain elevator would be responsible for providing you the safety data sheet on the grain. Then you could use that safety data sheet to develop, you could use what's in the grain safety data sheet then to develop your own for the final product. You see what I'm saying? So this is what this is designed. So you have a farm, everything originates from the farm, and that was also part of our discussion with OSHA. We told them, why should we be considered the manufacturer? Why not the farmer? They grow it. But they didn't believe that one. OSHA doesn't have jurisdiction over that, so they said, we're just going to stick with the grain elevators. Plus, I don't know, there are customers, they probably wouldn't like that either, right? So anyway, you have the farmer, then you have the storage, grain elevator, terminal, export facility. That's the other question that comes up too. It's like, well, what about from an export? What does that mean? Oftentimes you'll export this to to your client, could be out of country. Well, according to OSHA, you have to provide the safety data sheet to your downstream user, right? So is your downstream user, if they're in Canada, if they're in Mexico, if they're in Europe, wouldn't that be, it doesn't matter where they are, they're your downstream user, right? So even though OSHA doesn't have jurisdiction in any of those countries, what if they came to your facility and, were looking through your documents and, well, how come you didn't send your safety data sheet to Canada? So that's something else to consider. So anyway, so you have the farm, storage, processing, just as we talked about. Processing, you could get the grain directly, and then however you want to handle that. Manufacturing, suppliers, premix, feed manufacturers, distribution, the dealer, and then the customer. So yes, you do have to provide this to your customers that are producers. So you could be delivering feed to your producer, customer, and you'd still have to provide it to them. So this roadmap, so to speak, this diagram we put together, that's in the guidance document. So the question, does OSHA require labels under the hazard communication standard for feed and grain products? Does it require labels? So there's, as I talked about, there's the FDA exemption. So if a product is subject to labeling under the FDA, it's not required to be labeled under the hazard communication standard. And then the next question, what about biofuels? Okay, that's another question that comes up. So, what about, the byproduct of ethanol, it's distilled grain, right? And there's questions come up about that. So what if you're shipping your grain to a biofuel facility? Is that considered food or non-food? Would that fall under the labeling exemption? Well, isn't distilled grain a byproduct of ethanol? And isn't distilled grain used for feed? I mean, that's one way to look at it. So that's something to consider as you're developing these documents. So basically, and we confirmed this with OSHA. We sat down and we talked with OSHA and we brought up this scenario. And basically what OSHA said in the meeting, basically if anything is subject to, if it's subject to the FDA labeling exemption, or I should say the FDA labeling requirements, if it's subject to the FDA labeling requirements, it's exempt from the hazard communication labeling requirements. So it's right here. This is, this specifically states what is subject to the FDA labeling requirements. And so from your part, from your facility, your company, if you've made that determination, then my only suggestion is documentation. Are hazard communication labels required for products and ingredient blender supplies and ships for, non-animal use? Now, OSHA said if it's for there's the difference between food and non-food use, right? So that's like ingredients for fertilizers. I mean, that's just an example. But yeah, if there's something that if there's a grain product or whatever that's being used for a non-food use, it would require a label. Like, for example, cornstarch or processed corn, something to that effect that you're sending, it could be used to, for drywall, or it could be used for paste or something to that effect. But I know the question also comes up, well, what if I don't know what my customer's going to use it for? That also comes up too. You could be shipping a finished product to your customer, and who knows who they're going to distribute it to. Who determines if the use or sale of a company's product requires a safety data sheet for customers? So basically, as I was saying, OSHA doesn't make this determination. It's basically if you are the one that produced the product. And as I mentioned, according to OSHA, you're a grain handling facility, you're a chemical manufacturer. You produce the product, you're going to have to develop the data sheet. Now, wherever that data sheet goes, whoever you send this product to, that's going to be their decision. But if you're a grain elevator, I think there's pretty much everyone here is from a grain elevator. Yeah, you need to produce the data sheet for your product. So how often do I need to provide the SDS to a downstream user? Obviously, the initial shipment, June 1, you should have provided this. The other thing to look for is what may be convenient for you is to send it electronically, right? You would just send a PDF or something. Well, what if it's not convenient for your customer? You need to double check with your customer, your downstream user, on what's convenient for them. If they want it mailed to them, yeah. Uh-huh. Correct, and that's a good. As long as they're not, and I don't know if everyone heard that, but Roger was saying that they talked with OSHA, and OSHA said, or his company, they're going to be posting all the SDSs for their feed products on their own web page, on the company's web page, so they can send the link out to their customers and they can access it there. What OSHA doesn't want, yeah, Matt.
Maybe I'm behind on it, but OSHA does have a letter of interpretation. It's a while back, it states otherwise in that first submission I catch.
But what it says in the directive, though, for the inspector, what it says, though, is they don't want you to post it someplace where, you have to have a username and password, right? They don't want you to okay, well, it's on SDS Online. Nothing against SDS Online if there's any reps here. But what they're saying is they don't want you to post a link to SDS Online that would require username, password, membership, and say, okay, you go through here. If you want to post it and your customers, if they're aware of that and they agree to that, but if you have a customer that, say you develop feed for a farmer and, they don't have any internet or whatever, and if they want a hard copy, you have to provide them a hard copy. That's pretty much what it's. Yeah. Basically what it's saying is don't anticipate, or don't assume, I should say, that they just want it sent electronically. It would be best to check with your downstream user, your customer, to make sure that, what would be to determine the best method to distribute the SDS to them. Yep. Yeah, and that's whatever. Like I said, that's forever. I know every company is different logistically, how they operations. Everyone's different how they handle it, type of customers, number of customers, but whatever. After checking with the customer to make sure that whatever means that they're getting copies of this or have access to it is convenient to them. That's the important part. So then once again, we get into the feed manufacturing. Our feed manufacturer is required to develop a single SDS for a product containing mixture. And, this is where you get into the whole issue. Like before, you can't just staple. If you have a feed product that has 26 different ingredients, you can't staple 26 single SDS sheets and say, okay, here it is. You have to develop one safety data sheet that addresses all of the ingredients that are in your product. Right? Now, you don't have to do it if you have a premix. You could just put in the premix there. You don't have to go into all the detail on the premix because you can, you have that SDS from the premix supplier. But we're just saying is you can't staple them all together. You have to create one for your product. Which, if you have 4,000 types of feed you develop, that potentially could be 4,000 SDSs. But, if you have products that use the similar type of ingredients, or I should say the same ingredients, different amounts, you could develop a generic data sheet for that particular product. Bulk feed issue. Does a feed manufacturer need to provide an SDS for bulk feeds it produces? Yeah. If you have a bulk feed, like for example, if you have a retail store, right, where the farmer comes in to buy the feed, you still have to have a sign at that store saying an SDS is available for the farmer, okay? However, if you delivered it to the farmer, the bulk feed, you would have to provide him the SDS. So if you have, like I said, if you have retail and you have feed, you need to have, make people aware that a safety data sheet is available. Yeah, we talked about generic SDS for bulk and bead. Am I responsible for providing my customer with an SDS for a product that I resell but do not further process? And yes, the reseller is responsible for providing an SDS. So basically what it's saying is, obviously if you are you're the manufacturer from the grain handling side, you develop the SDS, you provide that to your customer. The customer can reuse that SDS. You can use the SDS. It's basically saying, the responsibility falls on, the grain handlers. This is the enforcement guidance. Actually, there was one other. I thought we had another. There are one other. I think there's two items on here, and I guess I forgot to put them on here. I think a key issue that has come up is transportation, right? So the question is okay, if this is considered a hazardous chemical, do I need to put a placard on a truck? Or what about a rail car? And as I mentioned, DOT has not changed their classification of hazardous material, right? Grain does not, they haven't changed that. So it's basically, as OSHA, as they say, if it's on wheels, it's DOT, not us. So even though at a grain handling facility, grain may be considered a hazardous chemical, if you put it on a truck or you put it on a rail car, you put it on a vessel, a barge, it's not considered a hazardous material. Okay? So if you're transporting it, you don't need to put the placards on the rail car, you don't need to put placards on the truck. So, but we still don't know with this developing. Who knows what the rail carriers or what the truck carriers are going to do as far as rates go? Who knows? Maybe they may get wind that this is a hazardous chemical to OSHA. We don't know, but the key point is, because there's questions. I've had members call. They said, "Well, I contacted this rail carrier and told them about this and asked them what their policy was going to be, and the rail carrier didn't know what I was talking about." I said, "You shouldn't have called the rail carrier." And they've said the same thing about the truck company. I called the truck company to see, are they going to change their policy because of this, or what do I need to do? Do I need to give a driver an SDS? And I was like, you shouldn't have called them, but no, you don't. Yeah, I'm sorry, did you have a question? Okay. So, as I mentioned, this all of this stuff, if you go to, pretty much you go on here, the hazard communication page, this is on OSHA.gov, and you can go in the hazard communication, safety and health topics page. They have all the information, all those documents I mentioned, that directive, for enforcement, all that stuff is there on the page. As I said, from the NGFA webpage, you can find the guidance document that I was talking about. That's all there and for your use. But as I said, June 1 was the date. That's when you had to start developing the safety data sheets, or I should say, provide it to your downstream users. And so, more than likely, OSHA is going to be coming out for inspections, and I guarantee you this will be like shooting fish in a barrel. They will be asking, as they always do, can I see your safety and health management plan? Can I see your hazard communication program? And they'll be flipping through, and they just see an old MSDS, or they don't think the SDS that you have is up to speed or adequate. I mean, they can write up the citations and move on. So probably and I said the only other I think point to raise is documentation. If you have not received an MSDS for a certain type of product, chemical, whatever that you use, have documentation on why you haven't received that. So with that, are there any other questions, comments on this fun, exciting topic? Everyone looks so down. Yeah. No, well, NFPA, I mean, this doesn't apply for NFPA. So, but EPA, I know there as far as EPA goes, this is solely OSHA. So, but DOT, and I've had conversations like with DOT and Coast Guard, because the issue is like, what if you're loading a barge, or you're loading an ocean-going vessel? Then you get into the whole issue with, the International Maritime Organization, and they have a whole separate classification for grain. So none of these other agencies, transportation-related or EPA, have changed their classification of grain dust or grain to be a hazardous material. It's just... Well, I mean, I know that's a what-if scenario, but you can make the argument if DOT didn't classify it, right? I mean, they haven't changed it. You weren't required to put a placard on the truck to, identify it as a hazardous material, because the whole question, the whole concern with that is okay, what if grain's a hazardous material? Then, just as I mentioned, what does that mean for rates? We don't want. That's why I said if you get the rail carriers and the trucks, this doesn't apply to them. I wouldn't be calling them. That's my suggestion. And as I said, some people were, just because they were just assuming, right? They were assuming if OSHA was changing their policy, the others would too. But it doesn't. The other agencies, as far as I know, have not changed their classifications. Yeah.
Is the NGFA, are they putting together any standard or SDSs for grain?
It's in the guidance document.
You have them
Yeah, if
corn, milo.
no, well, in the guidance document that's on our webpage, there's actually how many? There's 4. So you have it's for animal feed, for grain, and that's grain, both food and non-food. Flour is in there. Those are the 4, and they're sample safety data sheets. So if you, as a company, wanted to use that data that's in the safety data sheet, and if you wanted to create one specifically for corn, specifically for soybeans, specifically for wheat, you could do that. If you wanted to use that safety data sheet just for all the grains, you can do that too. That's your decision. But these sample data sheets were designed by, working with the other trade groups to address the primary, hazards within, I think the consensus was most types of grains.
Yes, just to add, a lot of people are using, I think, every development discount, they actually call it, well, people provided us their STS is full grain, every single one of them, we're exactly matching
Well, it's good. Well, I'm glad that they found that to be useful. I know some might be a little bit more, some companies might be a little bit more detailed than others, but as I said, I still think that there's a lot of companies out there that either aren't aware or don't realize, how they're considered the manufacturer, and, they need to comply. Because, as I said, this isn't going away. I mean, this is based on a, court decision. So we're going to still try to address it, but it's for the time being, it's grain's considered a chemical hazard.